Hi, my name is Terry Welch, and for my project, I decided to attempt to find out how accurate slave narratives are. So, what is a slave narrative? A slave narrative is an autobiography or dictated biography that was generally written between the 1700s and late 1800s by African American slaves. They usually depicted the most horrific incidents within slavery, and there is some evidence that these accounts were dramatized to increase their impact and press forth the notion to abolish slavery. What a lot of people do not know is that they were actually used as propaganda by predominantly white abolitionists because they had more pull politically than black former slaves would have had at that period in American history. So to examine every single slave narrative that's ever been written would take considerable amount of time which I do not have. So I chose two well-known narratives to take a closer look at. I will be going further with the Douglas narrative just because it's something we've covered in class, and also it's it was more of a kind of culturally impactful in its time than the Instance in Life of a Slave Girl, so I chose to use that one. So the first narrative I'm using is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave by Frederick Douglass. It's the book we've been covering in class. It's basically it's a coming of age telling of his life and his rise from slavery as a young man to hardworking abolitionist. Douglas begins with a few facts he knows about his birth and parentage. All Douglas knows basically is that his father was possibly his slave owner and his mother was a slave named Harriet Bailey, and he was separated from her really early in his life. Douglas, throughout his life, appears to want to free himself both physically and mentally from slavery, while keeping his tone forthright and sermon-esque within his narrative. He also mentions the horrid treatment of female slaves throughout his narrative. And I feel like his mother's treatment was a driving force behind his pursuit for the abolition of slavery. And religion was also a major role in Douglas's retelling of his life story. He speaks a lot of the hypocrisy of the slave owners who speak of God and religion, yet treat men and women like property. So the second narrative I chose to take a look at is one of my personal favorites. It's Instance in the Life of a Slave Girl. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this book, just I wanted to bring another book into the kind of narrative field. But it's Instance in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. It's more of a somber telling of her story. Unlike Douglas, Jacobs takes a softer tone and appears to be more apologetic in the way which she writes. She doesn't speak with the confidence of Jacobs or the kind of the power, but she takes a more romanticized approach, whereas Douglas is in your face with the reality, and he kind of hits you with slavery and his recreation of events. Jacobs adds more dialogue between her characters. Her narrative is told more like an oral story rather than an autobiography. Um, though she takes this approach, her romanticism comes through as more of a way of Jacobs to, as she puts it, excuse deficiencies in consideration of circumstances. And puts the focus on the characters in the story rather than on herself. She also makes a note at the beginning of her book that the characters' names have been changed, but she declares that all the stories enclosed in her autobiography are true. Though this can't be proven, the subtle and heartfelt approach Jacobs takes tells a lot about the author, and it's hard to deny her story reads like a macabre yet beautiful telling of a horrid time in American history. Okay, so who's Frederick Douglass? Douglass was born into slavery, and he was separated from his mother pretty much as soon as he was born. Um, all Douglas knew of his father was that he was more than likely his slave master, Captain Anthony. He's considered one of the most influential black leaders in U.S. history, and many attribute him as being one of the most important figures in the abolition of slavery. Douglass was influential in his time and was an affluent speaker. He spoke of the sickness of slavery and the issues that it caused in America and in the world, and the need to abolish it. Douglass also published many writings, and his most influential was his autobiography, which is the one that I'm using, which is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Like Douglass and many other slaves, Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery. But unlike Douglass, however, Jacobs knew both of her parents, and her father was a skilled carpenter, which allowed her family to live in better conditions than most slaves. While in her teens, Jacobs became involved with a white lawyer. I want to say she was 15 at this time. Samuel Treadwell Sawyer was his name. She had 2 children during this relationship, both of which were born during her time as a slave. Once Jacob she was moved on to the Norwood residence after her master, who she went to live with after her mother died, also passed away. And at this residence, she rebutted the advances of her owner, Mr. Norwood, on multiple occasions, and she refused to be his mistress. After this refusal, he sent her to a nearby plantation to work the fields. Jacob experienced much sexual abuse during this period and writes about it in her narrative extensively. In 1842, Jacobs escaped to the north and took up work as a nursemaid in New York City. The Jacobs narrative is arguably the most extensive narrative written by a female slave, and her children were definitely the driving factor in her attempts to abolish slavery. Both narratives compare on many levels. The evolution from illiterate slave to literate human being, seemingly the main driving force, besides, of course, the abolition of slavery and the telling of their life stories. Both Jacobs and Douglass were also separated from their mothers at an early age. Douglass was separated pretty much at birth, whereas Jacobs, at 6 years old, when her mother passed away, and she was moved on to a new master. They were both also willing to die for their cause. Just writing these narratives could have been a death sentence during the period they were published. The main difference in the narratives was the power in which the words were delivered. Douglass preferred a more sermon-like, to-the-point tone, whereas Jacobs is more soft-spoken in her words and incorporates more sentiment in her work. Douglass's narrative also focuses heavily on the evolution of manhood and contains many incidents of physical occasions. In Jacob's narrative, she prefers a more story-like way of approaching the difficult subject of her life. She romanticizes her characters by adding dialogue and bringing them to life for the reader, which is why it was not until 1981 that her narrative was verified by experts and not considered a work of fiction. So for the expert evidence, I decided to use David W. Blight's Frederick Douglass, Civil War, Keeping Faith in Jubilee. It's a biography of Frederick Douglass, and it is a must-read for anyone who wants to get into the mind of Douglass. Though it was published in 1989, Blight has compiled step-by-step breakdown of the mindset of Douglass at every turn and the effects of the Civil War, specifically, on his thoughts and writing. Blight tells of knowledge being the freedom that Douglass was searching for, and though Blight does not directly say every word Douglass pens is true, even stating that Douglass understood the power his pen had in gaining revenge upon his previous torturers, he believed that Douglass was an honest penman and was eloquent in his handling and writing of slavery as a topic. Blight also believes Douglass was an excellent politician. And because of this, he knew how to use his words in the most powerful way. Clearly, some embellishment can be seen, even in the analysis by Blight, but it is hard to argue with a man like Douglass, who came from nothing, as Blight puts it, to become the most important Black leader and thinker of the 19th century. So just to give you a little bit of a background about the author that I used for my expert evidence. So David Blight is a professor of history at Yale University. He's currently the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. For the study of slavery, resistance, and abolition. He is also a leading figure in the study of Frederick Douglass, and he administers the annual Frederick Douglass Book Prize Award, which is handed out to the most impressive nonfiction book in English. Clearly, when it comes to understanding Douglass, Blight's work is a must-read. So, to conclude, it's next to impossible to truly know how accurate a slave novel is. We could speculate for days and never come to a conclusion. However, we cannot take away from how important these slave narratives are historically. Especially Douglas's narrative, it was an abolition game changer. And even if it was not completely accurate, we cannot take away from how important it was to America and the incorporation of freedom within the United States. As for Jacobs, her narrative was not as significant as Douglas's during her lifetime, maybe because she took a less direct approach to Douglas and seemed to not want as much of the spotlight as Douglas. Even so, reading narrative is inspiring. Her innocence shines through, and she somehow brings a world of darkness alive and what can only be described as inspirational. Even if only half the content of these narratives were true, that would still be half a book's worth of degradation and human suffering that should never, ever have come to be.